Hello and welcome to this video where we're going to look at how cellular respiration and biofuel production are connected. We're going to look at this part of the study design, which is the uses and applications of anaerobic fermentation of biomass for biofuel production. So, a little bit of background. When we talk about fuels, often we're talking about fossil fuels. That's the one we tend to be really familiar with, and those are fuels that have formed over what's considered to be tens of millions of years, and they come from the remains of dead organic material. Now, because they take so long to form, and we have to find deposits of them, they're generally considered non-renewable. And this can be things like coal, oil, or natural gas. And so basically, once they're used up, they're gone. You'd have to wait an incredibly long time for that sort of thing to reform, given our understanding of the conditions required for them to form in the first place. On the other hand, a more contemporary form of fuel is something called biofuel. And this is fuel that's created from organic material as well. And that organic material, though, is called biomass. And it's just any organic material, and often it's one that we can actually source as a waste product from many industries. Now, the difference here to fossil fuels is whilst they both need organic material, fossil fuels required dead organic material to be in certain conditions with time and pressure put on them before they turned into these other compounds. Whereas biofuels we can actually create through much quicker processes. Some of the biofuels that you can actually make are bioethanol, biogas, or biodiesel. So there's a few different kinds there, and their composition changes a little bit. Often they come from slightly different original biomass products, and they go through a different process, so you end up with a slightly different product that will be used in different ways. But the point here is that these are compounds that are made through relatively quick processes that we can actually manipulate and control. And we can actually set up facilities to do these processes and to actually produce these biofuels. So whilst they're not renewable in the sense of, yes, we are using something up and we are taking that away, they're not so non-renewable like fossil fuels where once they're gone, they're basically gone unless you want to wait an incredibly long period of time. Biofuels, yes, once you've used it up, it's gone, but it's quite easy and quick to make more of it, and it's pretty easy to get the material, the biomass that you need to make the biofuel itself. So, in terms of the benefits of biofuels, the one I've just been talking about is really that we would actually consider them renewable. Like I said, we do actually use them up, and once that liter of bioethanol is used, it's gone. But because they're created from biomass and it is able to be relatively easily sourced from a wide range of industries, often as a waste product that those industries don't actually want, it actually means that we can use this waste product and convert it through these controllable and relatively quick processes to these biofuels that are able to then be used in place of traditional fossil fuels. Some of the things that we might use as biomass could be plants, it could be animal byproducts, it could be other biological waste material. So you can think there are, animal poo is often used because it to collect methane from, because it gets broken down by methanogens and they will release methane, and that can be used as a fuel, and that's from a waste material. It's not just a biological waste material, it's also an animal byproduct, or something that we use in a very traditional sense that we might forget is arguably a type of biofuel is wood, is actually something that you can use as a fuel source, and that comes from a plant, so it comes from biomass, and we can use it as a fuel source. Now, we're not particularly focused on something like wood and burning wood in this scenario because we're more interested in the types of biofuels we can make through anaerobic fermentation, and that's a different process. That's not what happens with wood. So biofuels are good because they are renewable, but they're also considered relatively carbon neutral. And that's because where we have them being used up and then releasing carbon dioxide, the carbon that they release is actually carbon that was originally captured by the plant or by a plant at some point during photosynthesis. Now, if we're talking about something that's actually an animal byproduct or a biological waste material, you might find that there's been a few more steps in the food chain from the plant to the animal consuming it, maybe even another animal consuming it before it's released as a waste product or a byproduct that we then are able to use. But initially, that carbon that eventually gets released as carbon dioxide, initially that's being captured by a plant during photosynthesis. So really, we're actually just talking about carbon that's getting cycled back into the atmosphere. And that carbon, as it leaves, can be used again as an input for other plants to photosynthesize. And generally speaking, because it's a much quicker cycle than what we would be talking about with fossil fuels, we really consider it to be no net increase in how much carbon dioxide gets released into the atmosphere. So carbon dioxide goes into a plant, the plant gets used or gets eaten, and eventually gets consumed as a biofuel. Carbon dioxide gets released, comes back, goes into the plant, and we kind of have this lovely little cycle happening. So biofuels are considered much more carbon neutral than fossil fuels. So we've talked a bit about biomass. We'll talk a bit more in detail about it. It is any organic matter from a living thing, could be from a plant, could be an animal, and it contains stored energy. And ultimately that's going to come from the sun. As we know that plants are our producers, and so they're going to take in the sunlight, they're going to photosynthesize with it. That energy is going to get stored in glucose, and then either that plant's going to get used as biomass, or it might get eaten by an animal, and that animal might get used as biomass, or it might produce something that gets used as biomass, or maybe it gets eaten by another animal, and that animal produces something that gets used as the biomass. So that is sort of where our energy in this biomass is originally coming from. We could be talking about, in terms of biomass, we could be talking about wood, we could be talking about that methane gas that landfill might give off, alcohol as things break down through fermentation. This is going to be a key one. Alcohol fuels are a type of biomass. Crops can be used and broken down, fermented as a biomass. Garbage is a waste product that has organic material in it, and that can be used as biomass as well. And generally speaking, biomass gets used either by burning it, so the heat gets released, and that can be used to produce electricity, or it can be converted through fermentation by microbes, and that's what we're going to be particularly interested in. We're going to want to look at how we can use microbes to take this organic material, ferment it, and produce these other compounds that then those liquids can go off, or those gases can go off and be used as either a biofuel or a biogas, and they can be used maybe in a car or in an energy plant to produce electricity and those sorts of things. So that's what biomass is, and that's how we can sort of have a flow on and use it. Now, when we make biofuels, there are two categories biofuels can fall into, and that's a first or second generation biofuel. And it really comes down to what type of biomass was actually used in making this biofuel. Was it one that is a food crop, or was it actually like a waste product? If the biofuel used biomass that was an edible food crop, that is a first generation biofuel. If, on the other hand, the biofuel is made from biomass that is a waste product, or it's a non-food crop or some byproduct from a different industry, that's a second generation biofuel. Now, second generation biofuels are actually in many ways much better than first generation ones. First generation biofuels, because to make them you have to use some edible food crop, you actually end up in competition with the agricultural industry. And so if we have arable land where we can grow crops on, there's only so much land available. And the question comes up, well, hang on, the crops you're growing, are they going to be used for human consumption, or maybe as feed for animals that we might need it for, or are they going to go straight into being used to make biofuels? And so you end up with this competition with this agricultural land. What is that product from that land going to be used for? Is it actually going to be used to be eaten like it normally would be, or are we going to lose land and lose the available cropland for producing these edible crops? Are we going to lose that to the biofuel industry? And there's a lot of debate around that. A lot of people, particularly farmers who want to make edible food crops, are not happy about that sort of thing. And anyone who is in the agricultural industry and relies on what that land produces as an edible food crop, they don't like this because there's competition there. This can also lead to habitat loss for any native species in the area. Agricultural lands that are being used to make edible food crops that then get eaten, there's a bit more appropriate use of them, and biofuels could end up logging areas or deforesting areas and losing habitat for native species, because really just focus on cramming in as much as possible to get that, because you're not actually worried about quality in terms of edible quality. You just want to make sure you're getting a lot of product to make this biofuel from. So it's first generation biofuels, not amazing, particularly with that competition with agricultural lands. Second generation biofuels, on the other hand, because they are a either non-food crop or a waste product or some other sort of byproduct from a different industry, no one's really in competition. They're generally stuff that other industries don't want. And so if you're going, hey, I can take this and I can use this to make a biofuel, they're like, yeah, great, take it, because otherwise we have to work out how to dispose of it. So anything made from a waste product in particular is really great, because you're actually, that waste would normally just be dumped somewhere and not have any future use. This is actually making us really responsible and making sure that we are appropriately breaking stuff down and using it in a really efficient manner. Sometimes it might not be so much a waste product, and rather it might be a crop of some sort that is not a food crop. And those might be things where you're actually able to grow those because we're not worried about food quality levels in terms of edible quality levels. You might be able to grow them in lands that normally you wouldn't want to grow a food crop on. And so then you end up needing land, but not having to necessarily compete with farmers who are trying to grow food crops for that land. So second generation biofuels are in some ways almost ethically better, because they're not in that same level of competition and they don't create the same levels of conflict. You might be thinking, okay, so why would you ever bother with first generation biofuels? Well, because first generation biofuels can actually be a little bit easier to make in terms of what you're starting with. The sorts of biomass that lead to a first generation biofuel can actually be, particularly with fermentation, it can be a lot easier to control and to produce material from that. So second generation biofuels are not necessarily bad, it's just often that they're harder to make from the sort of biomass you end up with, particularly if you're talking a waste product that might be contaminated with other things you don't want. You're going to have to purify it before you can use it, so it can add steps to the process. But as you can see, we generally are looking at a lot more second generation biofuels in play than there are first generation biofuels, which is really good. Now this brings us to exam question 1, and it says biomass is A, organic material from plants and animals, B, a non-renewable source of energy, C, only produced as a byproduct of photosynthesis, or D, only produced in the presence of oxygen. So you can pause the video, have a think, pick your answer, and then check your answer by watching the video linked in the description box below. So how do we go from biomass to biofuel? What are the actual steps involved here? Now, we want to focus on biofuel that's made via fermentation. That's what we're particularly interested in here. Obviously, you can argue, there are biofuels you can get from biomass. Otherwise, we're not interested in that. We just want to focus on fermentation. So bioethanol is an example of a biofuel that is produced via fermentation. It is ethanol that is produced from biomass, hence bioethanol. So bioethanol goes through the following steps: deconstruction of the original biomass, enzyme catalyzed hydrolysis of complex sugars, then anaerobic fermentation to produce ethanol, and final distillation and purification of the ethanol for use as fuel. Those are the general steps. You may see slightly different naming conventions for them, but generally speaking, that's what is happening. So we're going to go through each one in detail and see what is actually happening in those steps. So deconstruction. Now, deconstruction, you can see down the bottom, we can split this into potentially two groups. Let's say we're starting with corn. We might first actually mill the corn, and we're going to deconstruct it sort of through those physical grinding means, where we're going to grind it into a powder and increase its surface area. So that's one way we can deconstruct our initial biomass. Then we might look at, for corn here, liquefaction, where we're going to add water and cook it and start breaking down everything in it. So we're going to sort of more use heat and water to hydrate and to break things down a bit further. And so we're going to treat the biomass that way. Now, depending on the biomass specifically, you will have certain procedures in the deconstruction phase. But the whole point here is you are trying to break things down and increase surface area, because for when we get to fermentation, that's going to make that more efficient. So we can break things down through these physical techniques like mashing and grinding. We can heat the biomass. We could even use enzymes and chemicals. And you may very easily use more than one approach to get the best results. From deconstruction, we go to digestion by enzymes. Now, this may also overlap in some ways with deconstruction, because you might be using enzymes as part of deconstruction to break things down. In our corn example, we want to take our starch and we want to break that down into simpler sugars, because starch is quite a complex sugar. It's lots and lots of glucose molecules joined together. So in our corn example, we want to take that starch and we want to break it down into just individual glucoses, or maybe disaccharides if we can't quite get to glucose. So we use enzymes to help do this process. This process can sometimes be called saccharification. And this is where you are basically breaking down the polysaccharide into a monosaccharide. So that's where the word comes from. Now, generally speaking, this sort of reaction to break a polysaccharide down needs water. So it is technically a hydrolysis reaction. Hydro meaning water, lysis meaning to break apart. So you're using water to break apart. That's what hydrolysis means. Amylase is a good example of an enzyme that you might use here. Amylase is something that we have naturally in our saliva, and so when we're eating starchy foods, the chemical breakdown of it actually begins in our mouth thanks to our saliva helping to break down that starch. So this is what's happening in this stage. We've got all this sort of complex sugar that is still intact, and we want to start breaking that down, because our next stage, which is fermentation, doesn't use complex sugars. The microbes involved in the fermentation require simple sugars, so we need to prepare the sugar through this process to make sure that it's ready for fermentation. So this brings us to our fermentation step. So here we will use yeast, and there are different types of yeast. One that's appropriate for what you're trying to do and that's going to give the best results will be determined and then used at this step. So yeast will be used to facilitate the anaerobic fermentation, so no oxygen. And we know that when yeast does anaerobic fermentation, it makes carbon dioxide and ethanol, and it's that ethanol we're after here. And so thanks to our work in the step before, where we broke those complex sugars down into simple sugars, those simple sugars, particularly glucose, will be used in the anaerobic fermentation to produce that ethanol, and you're going to be able to make quite a lot of it. Essentially what we're doing here is, this is how we would make ethanol as an alcohol for human consumption, is you would go through very similar steps. But here we're not making it for human consumption. We're going to collect it and then we're going to use it as a biofuel. So the ethanol diffuses out of the yeast cells and then it will be harnessed for biofuel. And so once we have that, now obviously one thing to keep in mind that there is also the potential of there's a limit to how much ethanol those yeast cells can probably produce, based on the fact that we know from doing this sort of process to make alcohol for human consumption that there comes a point where the amount of the amount of ethanol that the yeast cells have made actually ends up killing the yeast cells. So there will be an upper limit to this, which means we end up with plenty of ethanol, but maybe it isn't as concentrated as we need. And that's where our next steps come in. So here we can consider it to be sort of a purification and almost a dehydration stage. Now, you can see down the bottom we've got a couple of different names. We've got distillation and denaturation. And distillation and dehydration in many ways are pretty much the same thing. Dehydration means to remove water, and distillation is a way of basically evaporating off the alcohol so it leaves the water behind. So you actually end up removing the alcohol from the water and collecting the alcohol itself. And so you are essentially still dehydrating it because it's getting rid of water out of it. So that's one important step. Remember, we only made so much ethanol before it would have killed the yeast. So like I was saying, there is a limit to how concentrated it would have been made in the step before. So here we are essentially concentrating it by getting rid of water and dehydrating it through a process called distillation. You also want to make sure that it's purified and any other products that might have come from the step before gets removed, because they would be problematic down the line if we're trying to use them as with the rest of the biofuel. It's not going to work out well. So after, you can see there it says after fermentation, still a lot of water mixed in with the ethanol. So the ethanol needs to be dehydrated via distillation, and the water basically is removed. And after distillation, we're going to remove those impurities. Now, there is an additional step, generally speaking, when we make alcohols like this, because we don't actually want people trying to drink it. It will be denatured. And this is not the same as what we talk about denaturation with proteins. This really is just involving using things that we add to the ethanol to make it poisonous, bad tasting, make it stinky, or nauseating. So basically trying to make it as unappetizing for people as possible. Because at this point we've got incredibly concentrated ethanol, it would be very bad for people to drink it. So we're going to add a few other things in there, like making it really gross to taste or stinky, to just really remove that temptation from anyone who has a problem with alcohol consumption. So this is a pretty standard practice when making very concentrated ethanol that is not intended for human consumption. We add stuff by, in this process called denaturing. Now, what gets added has to be carefully considered, because obviously we don't want to add anything that's going to affect the function of the ethanol as a biofuel. The whole point is we're just adding stuff that will stop people from drinking it. Sometimes that might be colouring agents, so you might, if you've gone and bought ethanol or other sorts of alcohol fuels, you might notice that sometimes they're coloured funny or they smell a bit odd, and those will be due to the additives that they've added to stop people from consuming it. But basically, once we get to this point and we have evaporated and condensed our ethanol to get a lovely pure sample, and we've treated it appropriately, then our biofuel is ready to be used as liquid fuel. And so that's really how we can go through the process of anaerobic fermentation. Now, here we've used the example of starting with corn, and that would actually make this a first generation biofuel, because corn is a food crop. It's something people can eat. So it doesn't have to be corn that you start off with. If you're like, oh, well, actually, I have this other product, or it's a waste product, and I can send it through a similar process and it will get release sugars that can then be fermented to produce ethanol, then you could do that instead, and you might be able to have a second generation biofuel by starting off with a different initial biomass product. And that would be really advantageous, because you're not going to compete then with people who actually want to use that corn as a food product. So this is the overall process, but just remember that it can be tweaked depending on what you're starting with. Alright, so I have a little bit of a video here just looking at how we can actually take leftover and waste product and turn it into biofuels.
It's 3 in the afternoon on a Wednesday when you hit the afternoon slump. You're tired, and probably not just because you were up late binge-watching season 4 of Buffy the Vampire Slayer. Your body's low on energy, so you grab an apple for a quick snack. Food is energy, after all, that's why we eat it. But instead of throwing away that core when you're done, try putting it in the garbage disposal. There's a lot of energy left in there, and this way, it might be converted into something useful. Because when food waste ends up in landfills, it actually creates a lot of problems. It takes time for that uneaten apple core to decompose, and meanwhile, bacteria are turning it into methane. That's an issue because methane is a greenhouse gas, and it's actually significantly better at trapping heat than carbon dioxide. Which got a lot of scientists thinking, what if you could figure out a way to control how the food waste decomposes, and in the process, produce energy we can actually use? That had the potential to help the planet and make lots of money, so win-win really, but it wasn't gonna be simple. The first challenge was just getting the food waste itself. Recycling programs are pretty successful, but it's still hard to get people to agree to scrape the food out of the takeout container before they throw it in the trash, or get restaurants to separate food scraps. Cities are slowly starting to get on board mandating that commercial establishments like restaurants send no more than a certain percentage of their waste to landfills, but even after they've separated out the food waste, there's still the matter of getting it somewhere to be processed, not to mention figuring out how to process it. At first, cities decided to take advantage of existing sewage treatment systems. We've talked here on SciShow about where the stuff in your toilet and sink goes after you flush, and eventually, part of it ends up in an anaerobic digester. Basically just a giant tank full of sludge and some specially selected microorganisms, but very little oxygen. Bacteria would normally digest that sludge using a reaction that has carbon dioxide as one of the products, but making carbon dioxide requires oxygen, and when there isn't enough around, they have to do the best they can with what they have. So they end up producing methane instead, and that's much more useful to us because the treatment plant can harness that methane and turn it into a usable fuel. When your apple core goes down the drain, it lands in the sewage system and eventually ends up in the sludge, where bacteria can use it to produce even more methane. So at first, cities simply added their food waste to the mix. Once they'd figured out that this was an effective way to turn food waste into methane, companies started building treatment plants specifically designed to handle food waste. Many of these plants have deals with local utility companies that are able to sell the extra fuel in the form of heat or electricity, or just compressed natural gas. Sell enough, and they turn a profit. But methane still isn't an ideal fuel. To move it around or burn it, you have to compress it first, which takes extra energy and makes the fuel less efficient. And while methane is easy to use in power plants once they get it, it's more difficult to use compressed natural gas to, say, power a car. That's why these days many companies are looking to turn food waste into an even more useful form of energy: ethanol. The stuff that is in your tequila, ethyl alcohol. There are plenty of industrial plants that produce ethanol from things like corn, and they've been doing it for decades. One of the more common techniques uses enzymes to convert cellulose into sugar, and then allows yeast to turn that sugar into ethanol and carbon dioxide. Since those plants use very specific raw materials, or feedstock, the chemical reactions are easier to control. Producing ethanol from an unpredictable mixture like food waste is more complicated. But there are already biorefineries that use other kinds of waste to produce ethanol, like one in Edmonton, Alberta, that started operations last year. That plant takes what's known as municipal solid waste, anything that can't be recycled or composted. Then it sorts that waste, separating out stuff that can be used as feedstock for that plant, like non-recyclable plastics and soiled cardboard. The feedstock is processed using gasification, where high temperatures, hot sand, steam, and oxygen are used to convert it into a mixture of carbon monoxide and hydrogen called syngas. Using catalysts to help spur the reactions along, the syngas is turned into chemicals like methanol and ethanol. Companies haven't yet applied the technology to food waste on an industrial scale, but they're working on it. As we develop more ways to use renewable fuels like methane and ethanol, scientists and engineers all over the world are working to take advantage of untapped energy resources like food waste. Among them are engineers at the Emerson Electric Company, which sponsored this episode of SciShow. Thanks to them for their support, and thank you for watching this SciShow Dose. If you want to keep getting smarter with us, you can go to youtube.com/scishow and subscribe.
Okay, so now we come to exam question 2, and it's just asking, how can the fermentation of biomass be used to produce biofuel? So you need to think through those stages and give a description. Pause the video, answer the question, and then check your answer with the video linked in the description box below. So we've talked about how we can make biofuels, what they're made from, but when do we actually bother using them? When do biofuels actually get used? Well, it's first of all going to depend on what kind of biofuel you're talking about. So bioethanol and biodiesel are two key types of biofuels, and bioethanol is, like we were looking at before, it's made via fermentation of plant sugars. So corn might be started, or any sugar that you can get from a plant, because we're going to use those yeasts to ferment the glucose into ethanol. So it uses carbohydrates. Biodiesel, on the other hand, is made via the formation of fatty acids from natural oils. So it actually uses fat. So bioethanol uses carbohydrates to produce bioethanol, and biodiesel is made from lipids. So there is a difference in the starting product there. Now, theoretically, both of these types of biofuels could actually even replace fossil fuels entirely. At the moment, the focus commercially is more on supplementing fossil fuels, so using a mixture of fossil fuel and biofuel, because the sorts of machineries that this fuel goes into, at this point, those machines are not yet properly equipped and designed to run on pure biofuel. There are some out there that are, but if you want to talk traditional cars, trucks or planes, anything with a combustion engine, most modern combustion engines are not yet being produced commercially on a massive scale in such a way that they will be able to use bioethanol or biodiesel. Some refinement would still need to be made to these systems, but there are plenty out there that can run on a mix of them. So whilst it doesn't eliminate our use of fossil fuels, by using a mix, we can certainly help reduce how much fossil fuels we're using, and even extend how long we will have fossil fuels for. You could, instead of using them necessarily in a day-to-day system, you might have bioethanol or biodiesel stored and used in backup power systems. So when there is a power outage and the power goes down, you have plenty of places that need to have power and can't be without. You think a hospital. If the power goes out, hospitals actually have backup generators to compensate for that, so that all those important pieces of equipment and machinery don't lose power, because you don't want someone's life support losing power, because then obviously that's going to have really negative consequences. So that's not the only place. There's lots of other places that would require power most of the time. And so having these sorts of things, if they're able to be stored for long periods of time, and we can put them into these sort of closed systems that we can get that will work with these biofuels, then this is also a really good use. You don't have to keep normal diesel or petrol on hand. You can have these biofuels on hand instead to run these backup systems. Now, in Australia, we do make biofuel. We have a number of places in Victoria that we actually are making biofuel. Some of it's bioethanol, some of it's biodiesel. We don't make first generation biofuels. Our biofuels are second generation biofuels, so they're made from waste and byproducts from other processes. What that means is all the land that we grow crops on is just for growing food crops. So we're avoiding any conflict there between our agricultural industries and our fuel industries, which is really good. Unfortunately, we are considered somewhat behind other countries in terms of our use of bioenergy, and we still use a lot of fossil fuel-based energy processes. Victoria and Australia are aiming to improve how much renewable energy, like they're using, such as biomass, in the generation of electricity. So, Victoria had a target of 25% of all electricity being produced by biomass by 2020, so it's a couple of years ago, and in 3 years wants to increase that to 40%. So that's the general goal in Victoria, and most of the biomass in Victoria that we're using is actually wood-based or wood waste. So it's either wood itself or some waste product from the wood industry. Now, what do we do in terms of bioethanol in Australia? Well, in Australia, we make it from a product called sorghum. This is a sort of a wheat type crop, but it is a waste product from this crop that we're actually using. So it's not the crop itself that we'd actually might want to use in making the breakfast cereal. It is a waste byproduct that's all full of starch that we can then break down into glucose and use in fermentation. So that's good. We're not using the actual grain itself that actually wants to be used by the food industry. We're using the waste product. So go us for doing that. Now, something we are looking at is whether or not we could use cellulose. Cellulose is similar to starch, but it's much harder to break down. It's a glucose compound. It's a polysaccharide that you'll find in plants, and it provides a lot of structure, like cell wall structure and that sort of thing. And it's not something that humans can actually break down. We don't have the ability to do that. There are animals that can do it, and they're able to eat grass, whereas obviously we can't eat grass because we can't break it down, and that's because of the cellulose in it. We just don't have the right bacteria or enzymes in us to actually break down cellulose. But cellulose is made up of glucose. So if we could break the cellulose down, then we would have glucose that we, in theory, could ferment to produce bioethanol. So that's something that's certainly being looked at. Now, where might you find bioethanol-based fuel? There are two types you've probably actually seen at the petrol station, and that's E10. And this is the most commonly available one. And you'll see this as like E10, or you can see there Super E10 at the petrol pump. And this is petrol, where 90% of what you're getting is petrol and the other 10% is ethanol. So it is a mix, and it's only done so that much because that's about as much as our current combustion engines in most of our cars that are able to take this can actually efficiently work with. Above that, it may run the risk of damaging the engine. Another type of product you can get is E85, and this is where most of what you're getting is actually ethanol. It's 85% ethanol, But this is for specialized and modified vehicles. So it's not available everywhere, and only certain vehicles can actually take it, and they have to have the right kind of combustion engine for it. So you can see there, E10, far more common, easier to use in most cars. E85, available at some places, but you do require the right kind of equipment to use it. Biodiesel is also made in Australia, and we make it from animal fats. This could be recycled cooking oil or vegetable oils, those sorts of things as well. Now, bioethanol has been pretty consistent in its use, but biodiesel has dropped off. So the amount we use in Australia has been getting less and less. And this could be a few things. If the international oil price goes down, then we didn't need to worry so much about using biodiesel. So that was one thing. And also that it's quite expensive, and the people making it are taxed quite heavily, and there was no real tax relief for them. So it was sort of becoming quite hard for them to keep making. Now, we make two types of biodiesel, just like we have generally two types of bioethanol, and that's B5 and B20. And that's where B5, unsurprisingly, means that 5% of the diesel you're getting is actually biodiesel, and B20 is where it is 20% of it. And there's actually only 4 companies at the moment in Australia that are producing biodiesel, and they're able to make around 170 million litres of biodiesel per year. So that's about where Australia is in terms of bioethanol and biodiesel production. So let's take a step back and think about where are biofuels good and what are their strengths, and where are their problems, where are their weaknesses. So generally speaking, with biofuels, they are great in terms of they've got lower climate impact because they're considered generally carbon neutral. So they're better than fossil fuels. They've got better energy security. So this means they're considered renewable, or at least reasonably easy to produce compared to fossil fuels. So we're not so worried about them running out on us, and we're reasonably secure in looking to the future and considering that we will actually have a fuel source. And they also present this really interesting localized energy benefit. And what this is generally speaking, when we use fossil fuels, they only come from certain locations where they are dug up and they're extracted from. Biofuels aren't like that. Biofuels can be made locally. So arguably, if Victoria ran on just biofuels, Victoria might be able to produce all the biofuel it needs to run everything it needs to in the state. And it wouldn't have to look outside the state to import in any fuels, which means you don't have to waste energy on transporting the fuel. You don't have to worry about risky environmental damage because you've had an oil spill. You're not relying on international import or export of fuels. You're not having your fuel supply controlled just by one place. For example, when you have COVID hit and it put all those restrictions on international movement and travel, that really could hurt fuel prices because suddenly things weren't able to be transported as easily and as freely. And so having biofuels means you wouldn't have to worry about that because, well, you wouldn't be transporting it internationally or anything like that. So it'd be far better in that sense. On the other hand, though, there are flaws with biofuels, or at least problems that need to be overcome. And the first, as we've discussed, is the whole food versus fuel idea. That if we are making biofuels and you're making a first generation biofuels and that uses cropland, then there's a fight there between what are we using that land for? Is it for food or is it to produce fuel? And so you end up with conflict between the agricultural and the fuel industries. The other weaknesses there is that biofuels, yes, they're considered carbon neutral, but when we burn them, they can actually produce other not great chemicals, particularly nitrous oxide, and they might actually make more nitrous oxide than fossil fuels, and this has its own problems with it. Using biofuels to get the biomass we need to get that material may actually mean that certain areas become deforested, and that could lead to loss of genetic diversity, so it can have impacts on local ecosystems for where biomass is trying to be taken from. So that can be an issue that needs to be addressed and make sure it doesn't happen. And finally, it is expensive. Fossil fuels are not cheap in what amount of money needs to go into setting up the equipment and everything to get the fossil fuels, but what you're required to spend to set up to produce biofuels is not cheap either. In fact, it's probably more expensive. And it's also hard when you're talking about a process that's going to be more expensive and you're going to produce a product that not everyone who currently uses fossil fuels is going to be able to swap to what you're using and producing. And so suddenly you've got far less a market in terms of who you're able to sell to and what you're able to get from it. So it's going to cost a lot, and you maybe not going to get the same returns from what you're actually producing as fossil fuels would. And it's a really small industry, and it's very hard to get people to uptake it and to start using biofuels over fossil fuels. There's a lot of lack of knowledge and understanding. It can be more expensive, and that's the thing. So it's all really difficult to get things actually adopted by the society and the community that you're trying to introduce it into. So yes, biofuels have these great strengths, but at the same time, they have some real flaws to them. And if you want to get biofuels being used, you'd have to really address these weaknesses and eliminate them, or at least reduce them as much as possible. So we're going to watch a video now, and it's just going to run through some of those pros and cons of biofuels.
Today's video is just a quick one to look at the pros and cons of biofuels. When we say biofuel, all we mean is a fuel that's made from recently living organisms. The fact that they were recently living is an important distinction, because fossil fuels are also made from living organisms. It's just that those organisms lived millions of years ago, and were converted to fuel by a very different process. Biofuels generally come from plants or algae, because these organisms can photosynthesize, and so they can lock up the sun's energy, which can then be released later when we burn them for fuels. We can also use animal waste, but this is often done at a much smaller scale. Although burning biofuels releases carbon dioxide, we normally think of biofuels as being carbon neutral, because they took up that carbon dioxide while they were growing. So there's no overall release of CO2. Because we can grow biofuels over and over again, they're effectively a renewable resource, and they're also relatively cheap to make. Another benefit is that they're easy to transport, and we can mix them with fossil fuels like petrol. This means that we can benefit from biofuels without having to get new cars, like we would if we wanted to use the electricity generated by solar or wind. The issue, though, is that in reality it's not quite that simple. For one, we need somewhere to grow all of these plants, and generally that means converting natural land, which could involve things like cutting down forests. This means that even before we get the first crop of biofuels, we've already damaged the environment, and potentially burned down loads of trees, releasing tons of CO2. Another problem is that the harvesting of the plants, processing, and then transport of all the fuels all require energy, which probably means more CO2 being released. Overall, it's hard to tell how good biofuels really are. They're definitely not as good as we first thought, but when used properly, they can be a great substitute for fossil fuels. And as with all renewable energy resources, it's not all or nothing. We can choose to use biofuels where it does make sense, and use something else where it doesn't.
Okay, so now we have exam question 3, and it says, while more sustainable than other sources, there are some concerns about the use of biomass and its sustainability. A, outline 2 considerations that need to be made in regards to the sustainability of the use of biomass, and B, will we ever run out of biomass, and justify your response. So you can pause the video as you go and answer this, and then you can check your answer with the video linked in the description box below. Now, here I have a few extra videos just looking at biofuels, and we've got one there looking at how do you actually make biodiesel as an actual experiment, and a few other things just looking at how we understand biofuels, what they are, how they're made, and those sorts of things. So you're welcome to go and watch them and get a bit more info. You don't have to watch them, but they are there for you if you'd like to. This now brings us to the end of the PowerPoint. If there's anything you didn't understand, you can go back and rewatch that section, or reach out to your teacher for further clarification. Otherwise, I'll see you in the next video. Bye!